Chapter 3. In early fall of 1927, a young Mexican man stopped by Warm Springs Insane Asylum in search of work. As a migrant worker, Esteban Garcia had slaved for meager wages in the potato fields of North Dakota and the orange groves of the South. At age 16, he left his family and struck out on his own. Odd jobs in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Sioux Falls drew him westward. Too small for work in the Butte mines, his determination to escape migrant work finally landed him at Warm Springs. Waiting for his interview, Esteban glanced nervously around the waiting room with its tall ceiling and stark walls. It reminded him of the police stations many migrant workers knew all too well. Finally, a huge man with graying hair called Esteban into his office. The man seated himself behind an expansive oak desk and lit up a half-smoked cigar. Esteban sat exposed in a single wooden chair. The portly interviewer cleared his throat as he glanced over Esteban's application. Esteban Martin Garcia, age 17, the balding man read from the application. Without raising his head, he scrutinized the slim Mexican over his bifocals. Yes, Esteban stammered. Why haven't you found work in Butte? Senor, they say I'm too small. What is it you wish to do here? Anything, senor. I work hard. You will see. I will show you. The interviewer stood smiling. He dwarfed the young Mexican boy. Son, many people think work at this asylum is easy work for good pay. Let me assure you it is neither. The fact is, if you are too small for the mines, you're probably too small to be much use here. Esteban stared up at the immense man with a pleading look. For what am I too small, senor? Let me explain. First, we get by here on a budget that couldn't support half of our 2,000 patients if they were in a community. That means our employees are underpaid, overworked, and seldom given much thanks. But I do not want big money, senor, the young man argued. I want to help people. We are not a rehabilitative facility, Esteban. We are strictly a maintenance facility. We do little beyond feeding and cleaning. In the wards, attendants often restrain violent patients or lift bedridden ones for cleaning. Some patients weigh upward of 200 pounds. How, Esteban, do you suppose to do that? Esteban fidgeted with his pant leg. Senor, everywhere I work I have been small. Big bodies do not work hard if they have small minds. Esteban winced, hoping he had not offended the big man. Pointing at his own head, Esteban continued. My mind is big and works hard. You will see. The interviewer laughed. Determined fellow, aren't you? Si, senor. Can I work now, please? Tell you what, son, I like your attitude, and I'll give you a try. Do you understand what probation is? Probation. Esteban repeated the word, fearful that this was a test of his competency. I think I know. Let's see. The interviewer smiled. Probation is a trial period. I'll hire you for 2 weeks and then decide if you can stay. Is that clear? Si, senor, si, senor. Esteban nodded excitedly, and work he did. By spring, Esteban became the favorite of every charge nurse lucky enough to have him on the infant's ward. Every day after his shift, Esteban walked around the ward, saying goodbye to each child. He always stopped longer at Petey's crib. Leaning on the worn top rail of the crib, Esteban talked to Petey as he would a normal child. Before long, Petey's face broke into a smile whenever Esteban approached. Petey had outgrown infant's ward a couple of years before, but remained, even as an 8-year-old, because the ward suited his care better. One day, Esteban nibbled on a Hershey bar as he visited with Petey. Petey's eyes followed the candy bar. Do you like candy? Esteban asked. Here. He broke off a little piece and placed it in Petey's gaping mouth. Immediately, Petey's tongue darted back and forth, chasing the tiny chocolate bit in circles. Brown chocolate melted onto his tongue and palate. Petey looked past Esteban, unable to concentrate on more than the melting wonderfulness he had pursued in his mouth. From then on, Esteban brought Petey a small piece of chocolate every day when he left. After several months, he started questioning Petey before handing him the chocolate bit. Does Petey want this? He'd ask. Petey would smile, flopping his 2 contracted arms and grunting. One day, Esteban asked the charge nurse, What's wrong with the little Petey boy? He's an idiot, the nurse replied plainly. What does that mean? It means he can't think. Esteban shook his head but said nothing. Several days later, Esteban approached Petey's crib after work. Holding out a small piece of chocolate, he asked the customary, "Does Petey want this?" Flopping his arms and gurgling, Petey waited. "Petey, you tell me, you want this?" Again, Petey flopped his arms, grimacing and grunting. "Petey, do this," Esteban instructed, nodding his head deliberately. Once more, Petey flailed his arms, grunting his impatience. "Petey, do this," Esteban insisted, nodding his head up and down in a yes motion. Petey skewed his face into a frown and turned his gaze away from Esteban. Okay, here, I'll give Petey chocolate." Esteban poked the piece of chocolate into Petey's mouth. Petey's tongue shoved the chocolate bit out onto the sheet. Esteban retrieved it and placed it once more into Petey's mouth. Again, Petey ejected it onto the white sheet, along with the stringy brown saliva. "If Petey doesn't like chocolate, I won't bring any." Esteban turned and walked away. Stopping by the door, he looked back towards Petey. Something bothered him terribly about this child, but he didn't know what. That night, a light from the nurse's station, a glassed-off room at one end of the ward, cast a dim glow across the darkened rows of white cribs. Except for an occasional whimper or cough, the children slept soundly. Down on the south end, in the center crib, one child remained awake. Looking up into the darkness, Petey struggled and fought with his body. Black shadows hid up and down the jerking of his face. The following day, as Esteban left the ward at the end of his shift, he stopped without chocolate to say goodbye to Petey. Before Esteban could speak, Petey grunted and jerked his head up and down in an unmistakable yes. Esteban stared. "Madre de Cristo," he muttered. "Petey, you wait. I'll get you chocolate." Running as fast as he could to the nurse's station, Esteban grabbed a chocolate bar from the concession box. Depositing the usual 2 cents in the can, he ran back to Petey's crib. "Today, Petey, you get the whole bar," he announced. Petey grinned as if his face had cracked in half. Grunting and flapping his arms like wings, he jerked his head forward and back again, and again, in gesture of triumph. Several weeks later, Esteban brought the charge nurse to Petey's bedside. "I have something to show you," he said. The nurse watched as the little idiot in bed, number 6, grunted and gestured for chocolate. "Esteban, is this what you brought me here to see?" she said accusingly. "What you're seeing is merely a conditioned behavior. Even idiots can be conditioned with bits of food. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She turned and left. 2 sets of eyes watched her as she walked away. Esteban shook his head. "Petey, you're no idiot." That same afternoon, a group of civic leaders from Butte toured the facilities at Warm Springs. Always popular in the tour was a walk through the wards. "Here, ladies and gentlemen, we have Infants Ward," the superintendent recited from habit. "Please feel free to ask questions." The group remained deathly quiet. Turning at the end of the ward near Petey's crib, a balding man remarked to his colleague in a half-whisper, "What a bunch of freaks." Esteban overheard the remark and flushed with anger. "They are not freaks," Esteban shouted loudly. "They are poor children." The group turned and stared as the 2 men lowered their heads in embarrassment. The superintendent gave Esteban a severe look. "I'll talk to you later," he said. The group filed from the ward, continuing their tour of the facility, fulfilling their civic duties. The following day, Esteban failed to show up for work. Each time the charge nurse walked by his crib, Petey grunted and swung his arms widely. Pleading with his eyes, he jerked his head up and down, back and forth. But without Esteban, every subtle gesture that had become Petey's language, his way of touching the world, was once again seen as the movements of an idiot. Chapter 4. 3 years after Esteban disappeared, on a lazy spring day, Petey's numbing rhythm of existence exploded. "Which one is Petey Corbin?" hollered a mullish-looking attendant, whisking past the nurse's station. He pushed along a wheelchair with reckless abandon. The wicker chair had a stained oak frame with the nicks and scratches from years of abuse. Bicycle tires supported the heavy affair. "Bed number 6, far end in the center," the charge nurse called back. She knew they were coming over from the men's main compound today to move young Petey. At 11 years of age, he had long outgrown the infants' ward. Spinning the chair on one wheel, the attendant cruised along the ward as if shopping for groceries. He wrinkled his nose. Even the lye used for cleaning could not mask the wretched sweetness of body waste. Number 3, number 4, number 5, the white-clad man counted aloud, chasing on the desired crib. Number 6, here we go. Turning the wheelchair sideways, he stripped the sheet off Petey's. "Oh, geez, what's this?" he exclaimed, looking down at the contracted body lying in front of him. "Hey," he shouted back across the ward, "I can't haul this in a wheelchair." "What now?" the charge nurse muttered under her breath, pushing back from the desk. "Would you rather carry him?" She headed towards Petey. "He'll fall out before I get to the men's compound." "Here," she said. Deftly she swung Petey into the chair and pulled the sheet off his crib. Twisting it like a rope, she pried it under his stiff arms and tied it around the wooden back. "If you have him in this chair often, lay the back down and put pillows under him." "This won't become a habit," muttered the attendant. Petey's head flopped forward, and the sheet pulled tightly against his chest, hunching his shoulders up on each side of his ears. Unable to lift his neck, Petey stared at his knees and strained wildly to grasp what was happening. The spoke wheels started rotating faster and faster with a loud clatter. The wood floor slats blurred. Approaching the stairs, the attendant tightened his grip on the handles. Roughly, he lowered the wheelchair down 2 flights of stairs, jolting against each step. Petey winced each time his head bounced. Before Petey fully recovered from the jarring descent, the attendant pushed him outside, bouncing hard over the door threshold. A late breeze greeted them with the smell of fresh-cut grass, lilacs, and honeysuckle. The smells could almost be tasted. Releasing each breath reluctantly, Petey quickly gulped more. He'd felt the wind before, but only for brief moments as he passed an open window, going to his weekly bath. Not since the day Petey had arrived at Warm Springs 9 years ago had he been outside. Now shivers rushed over him. The air flowed across his entire body, tugging at the white sheet covering his legs. It tickled. The sun, long limited to poking only thin beams of light into the ward, bathed the whole world. Even with his head forced forward, Petey squinted and blinked against the dazzling brightness. He smiled, and his eyes watered. For 10 minutes they wound down the long walkway. There seemed to be no limit to distance or space. They rolled and rolled, never stopping. How far could a person go without coming to a wall? Suddenly, a loud beep caused Petey to jerk. A big black contraption rattled past, smoke and dust billowing from behind. Twisting his gaze sideways away from his knees, Petey could see a person sitting in the contraption. He followed its progress as far as his eyes could allow. Blinking in his amazement, he grinned, arms flopping wildly. He felt so alive. "Look at that, kid. It's a new Packard sedan. Ain't she a beauty?" the attendant commented. Petey failed to understand what he meant. "In this new ward, you're going to meet some real stooges, kid." The attendant's sarcasm flowed thick, as if leading a tour group. "We got blacksmiths, boilermakers, gamblers, doctors, prize fighters, even preachers, all under one roof. Yep, this is quite the cultural affair." The walk from the infants' ward passed all too quickly. A big red brick building loomed sideways into Petey's sight. The glory of being outside faded quickly. After backing through the front door, the attendant jarred and jolted the wheelchair back up 2 flights of stairs. Each bump knocked away chunks of Petey's enchantment. The corner bed had been readied. With a grunt of relief, the attendant dumped Petey roughly onto the bed. "Glad we don't do this every day, kid." Petey eyed the attendant quizzically. For Petey, the trip had been wonderful. Propped against a pillow, with his head tilted up toward the open room, Petey examined his roommates for the first time. There must have been nearly 50 men, all adults. Nearby, a tall man with no pants and knotty joints stood on a bed shouting, "Repeat, and you shall be saved. The day of the Lord is at hand. You are sinners, but I have come to deliver you. Everybody pray with me." The man closed his eyes, as if the whole room had followed his bidding. Rocking on the bed, unsteady in his self-imposed darkness, the frail man prayed a prayer, worn dull by repetition. He stole peeks to steady himself, to check on his imaginary congregation. Petey looked beyond the preacher. Near the window, a gaunt man chewed on his half-devoured shirt. His eyes were hollow as his ribs. Dozens of patients were scattered about the room, their half-dressed bodies huddled against walls and beds. Most clung to their knees. Some gazed into nothingness or sat on chairs, heads drooped forward, totally unaware of the madhouse or even the flies crawling across their necks. Several stared out the dirty windows, their gaze focused a million miles away from Ward 18 of the men's main compound. In the day room at the far end of the ward, half a dozen patients sat around two large wooden tables, playing cards or rolling cigarettes. Noise echoed from everywhere and nowhere. One young man with baggy pants drawn tight at the waist paced back and forth, talking earnestly to himself. As if on cue, several patients turned and wandered toward Petey. Curious about the new arrival, they converged as a horde on the helpless 60-pound boy. Their questions blazed out like cannon fire. "What's your name? Do you smoke? Did you have an accident? Hi, I'm Joe. I know the president." A few reached out to touch or pinch the new stranger. Petey looked up at the circle of faces with terror in his eyes. Grimacing, he flailed his arms, hitting the spectators and scattering them like chickens. They stood just beyond Petey's reach, hazarding their remarks. "You hit me, you jerk. I'm going to tell Bob." "What'd you do that for? You're going to get in trouble." "I'm Joe. I know the president." Petey cowered until the group moved away. Why had they brought him to this terrible place? The first night, Petey whimpered and twitched in a fitful sleep. He dreamed of faces circling his bed. Not until dawn did he fall into a peaceful slumber and dream of his walk outside. He felt the wind and smelled the air. He dreamed of happy voices and loving arms that held him in a place too wonderful to be real. When morning came, Petey awoke slowly, reality diluting his thoughts into vague shadows that retreated from his mind. Suddenly, the lights flashed on. "Everybody up and at 'em! Come on, Johnny, Sam, Joe, let's go! It's 6 o'clock!" An attendant barked his commands as he walked down the aisle, clapping his hands and kicking the beds of delinquent sleepers. He went directly over and started cleaning Petey. "This sure is going to be fun every day," he grumbled, hoisting Petey into a wooden wheelchair. "I have 50 other morons to care for, and the head nurse says she wants you to be taken out of bed each day." Petey rested awkwardly on two pillows. Except for a shirt and a white sheet over his chest, the attendant left Petey naked. Petey gestured wildly for his wheelchair to be moved nearer to the window. "Settle down, dang it," the attendant scolded. "You'll get everybody worked up." Petey quieted but kept pleading with his eyes until the attendant walked away. Helplessly, he returned to the unrelenting rhythm of boredom. If the pattern had numbed Petey's mind at the infant's ward, here it throbbed even stronger, crippling and paralyzing his existence. Every patient, active or passive, lived with the general din of mayhem that surrounded them. It went unnoticed like the roar of a waterfall as time passed. Daybreak, sunset, daybreak, sunset. Above Petey's bed, a large square heater hung from the high ceiling. In colder months, the furnace billowed with a roar that exacted many sleepless nights. While burning, it cast a dancing reflection of light across the wall and onto Petey's wheelchair parked beside his bed. The heater, not sufficient for the whole ward, heated excessively directly below the vents. Many nights Petey squirmed and twisted, shoving aside suffocating blankets, only to have the furnace shut down. Soon the air cooled, leaving him shivering without covers. Attendants served food in the day room. Unable to feed himself, most of Petey's contact with others came during mealtime. Lying on his back, he often choked on food. Everyone ignored him, blaming it on his spastic nature. Petey strained once to raise his head so he would not gag. "Hey, fellows, settle down or we'll skip supper," the attendant cautioned. After one missed meal, Petey resigned himself to the choking. Because of the gagging, many mouthfuls of bread, potatoes, and meatloaf ended up all over Petey's wheelchair. Always rushed, the attendants often forgot to shake away crumbs or small chunks of food, which fell in the folds of the sheet covering. Petey noticed the small droppings, but had no way of knowing they would soon bring great joy and one day even greater sorrow.